So I want to show you the map to show you where the journey goes. All right, so I'll share this with you too so you can have a copy of it for yourself. So it's a narrative of a journey made in the year 1737 by Conrad Weiser, Indian agent and provincial interpreter from Tulpehocken in the province of Pennsylvania to Onondaga, the headquarters of the Allied Six Nations in the province of New York. Translated from German by Hester Mullenberg, MD of Reading, Pennsylvania. So it had to get translated. So again, it was written in German, originally in German, and it got translated to English, so we might lose some words. So that's why it's important to have people study these other languages so that they can kind of pick up those type of things, so that there's something that that's important that we might miss. All right. So in the year 1736, Governor Gooch of Virginia requested of the government of Philadelphia that it should make known the so-called Six Nations by regular embassy that he, Gooch, was desirous of establishing a peace between the Allied Six Nations, living in the north, and so-called Cherokees and Catawbas in the south. I just want to stop and start talking about those two groups. But yes, that's our traditional enemies in the south, where these there was Cherokees, which are Iroquois-speaking people as well, and Catawbas, who are Siouan-speaking people, and further south as well near Georgia area. So those are our traditional enemies at one time or another. And that he, the Governor Gooch, had already so arranged the latter tribes would send deputies by next spring, to which the chiefs of the Allied Six Nations should be invited. And in the meantime, a truce should be proclaimed for a year long, to which others should already be agreed to. I was required to perform this duty and received regular instructions by James Logan, Esquire, the time president. 1737, on the 27th of February, I left home for Onondaga, which is the place where the Allied Six Nations hold their council. It is situated in the center of these nations on a river that empties into the Great Lake of Ontario, from which the Great St. Lawrence flows. I took with me a traveling companion, Stuffle Stump, a white man, and an Onondaga Indian who had been laying sick since last summer. But he had now recovered. His name was Owiskala. So that's pretty cool too. We get these names of people, so we have to kind of dig around and say, who the heck is that? So the 28th was remained at Tohill on account of the bad weather and to procure some necessities for the journey. The 1st of March we start from Tohill, which is the last place in the inhabited part of Pennsylvania. And the same day we reach the top of Kitanani Mountain. So it's right around here, this area here, there's Blue Mountains and stuff like that. Right around here, that's where he's traveling up through here. Actually, right there too. That's where he takes that travel up there, and so you get a good idea of what the traveling is like in these times and why we have those ceremonies Edge of the Woods, for example. This is a really good account of why those ceremonies were taking place for people, because you'll see what it was like to travel in those days. So, the 1st of March we start from Tohill, which is the last place inhabited of Pennsylvania, and the same day we reach the top of Kitanani Mountain. The snow was about a foot deep. The 2nd and 3rd we found nothing but ice under the new fallen snow on the north side of the mountain, which caused dangerous falls to ourselves and horses. The 4th we reached Shamokin, but did not find a living soul at home who could assist us in crossing the Susquehanna River. The 5th we lay still. We had now made about 80 miles. On the 6th we observed smoke from the other side of the river, about a mile above our camp. We went up on the opposite side of the place and saw a small hut. An Indian trader was induced by repeated firing of our pieces to come over. Again, that was another custom they used to do a long time ago when you wanted to have any type of short meeting with somebody you didn't know, especially with the colonies or settlements or something like that. You wanted to draw their attention peacefully, you'd fire volleys. And then the same likewise for the colonies to allow Six Nations people to come into their villages, they'd fire their guns, and that was like a salutation, that was like a greeting as well in those days. So that's why they're shooting their guns. They're not shooting at each other, they're shooting in the air just as a welcoming, we're welcoming you here. All right. So we went to Shamokin, Susquehanna River, we observed smoke. All right, so firing our pieces to come over and take us safely across in 2 trips, but now without great danger on account of the smallness of the canoe and the river being full of floating ice. We were obliged to leave our horses behind as it was impossible to get them across. We lay still today. On the 7th, we started from being here on a long branch of the river. The main stream comes from the northeast, where we went to the northwest. We found that that we had commenced our journey in the wrong time. All the streams were filled with water and swollen, particularly those we had to cross. An old Shawano, so Shawnee, and he has his name too, but I don't know Shawnee or anything like that, but it has his name in here, so that would be something to take note of as well. Took us on his canoe across the creek. I presented him with some needles and a pair of shoestrings. He was very thankful and behaved as though I thought he had received a great present. On the 8th, we reached the village of Chikalamo, and that's an Oneida person, very important for the Pennsylvania area. He was one of the chiefs had delegated him to kind of be like the person in charge of the Pennsylvania area, kind of watching over everything. So that's why they were going to him, because he has like a lot of diplomatic ties. All right. Who lives was appointed by the president to be my companion and guide us on our journey, and we lay by. The water still rose higher. Guide on their journey. He was, however, far from home on a hunt. The weather became bad, and we lay by. The waters rose still higher, and no Indian could be induced to seek Shikalama until it was cleared up. On the 12th, the 2 young Indians agreed to go out in search of him. On the 16th, they returned with word that Shikalama would return by the next day, which so happened. The waters had again risen by reason of warm and rain, which melted the snow of the forest. Several Indians arrived by water from 6 nations who had reported that the snow was still waist deep in the forest, and it was not possible to proceed without snowshoes. The Indians at this place were out of provisions. Our little stock was soon exhausted, as there were numerous families in this house where we lodged. We expected on leaving home to supply ourselves with provisions at this place, in which we were entirely disappointed. I saw a new blanket given for about 1/3 of a bushel of Indian corn. Here we began already to suffer the pangs of hunger and other troubles forced themselves on us. It was a great difficulty that I procured a small quantity of cornmeal and a few beans for our journey. On the 21st, we ventured to proceed on our journey to Onondaga. There were now 5 of us. Shikalama accompanied me, and we were joined by a warrior who had been on a war expedition to Virginia and was heading home in the same direction as we were traveling. In the forenoon, we reached a large creek. It was very high. We had taken over in a canoe, not without great danger. The next day, 2 English traders attempted to cross. Their canoes were overturned by the force of the current. One of them had drowned. The other only escaped by swimming. Today, we passed the place where the Indians in former times had a strong fortification on a height. It was surrounded by a deep ditch. The earth was thrown up in the shape of a wall, about 9 or 10 feet high, as many broad. But it is now in decay as a form of appearance. It had been deserted beyond the memory of man. On the 22nd day, we came to a village called Onondago, from a high rock which lies opposite. However, before we came to the site of the village, we reached a large creek which looked more dreadful than the one yesterday. After repeated firing of our guns, 2 Indians came from the village to see what was to be done. They brought, at our request, a canoe from the village and took us across. We quartered ourselves in Madame Montour, who's another person that's extremely important in our history as well, but it's like she gets lost and all that stuff. But it's really interesting that she kind of pops up here too. Sorry, not to break it. A French woman by birth, but of good family, because she married an Oneida chief actually at the time. And she was adopted by 6 Nations when she was about 10 years old actually too. That's what the other thing that's super interesting about it. But now in the mode of life, a complete Indian. She treated us very well according to her means, but had very little to spare at the time perhaps. Dared not to let it be seen on account of so many hungry Indians about. She had several times in secret gave me and Stoffel as much as we could eat, which had not happened to us before in 10 days, and showed us great compassion for us, saying that none of the Indians where we were going had anything to eat except the Onondagas, which my Indian fellow travelers refused to believe until we found it true by experience. On the 23rd day, we lay still on account of rainy weather. 2 Indians arrived by water in canoe made of elk skins, who had said that the high wilderness in the snow was still knee-deep. I received from Madame Montour some provisions for the journey. We now have advanced 130 miles. On the 24th, we proceeded on our journey from here. In the forenoon, found the snow 2 feet deep, as it had been very cold during the previous night, as it was frozen so hard that we could walk over the surface without breaking through the crust. In the afternoon, we came to a thick forest where the snow was 3 feet deep but not frozen so hard, which made our journey fatiguing. We were between 2 high and steep mountains, and a small creek flowed through the valley, opposite direction to our course. The valley was not broader than the bed of a stream, and on both sides were frightful high mountains and rocks overgrown with careful palmwood, with carrel or palmwood. The passage through here seemed to be altogether impossible. I at once advised to turn back. The Indians, however, encouraged me to persevere, saying that the little distance the mountains were further apart, and that we could easily proceed. I agreed at last to go. The Indians took the lead and clambered with hands and feet along the side of the mountain, and we followed after. I had a small hatchet in my hand, in which I broke the ice to give us a foothold. There was considerable danger of freezing our feet, as we were often obliged to cross the streams and had no space to keep our feet warm by exercise. After clambering in this way, we reached a point where the valley began to widen and became more spacious. We made a fire and waited for an Onondaga Indian who was far behind. Because he was still weak from the illness he had undergone, in those 3 hours we had not advanced over a mile. The wood was altogether the kind called by the English spruce, so thick that we could not generally see the sunshine. After we had warmed ourselves and taken some food, we proceeded onward. In the evening, made our camp under the spruce trees. We broke branches to cover the snow where we lay, and then constituted our beds. We made a large fire on top of the snow, which was 3 feet deep. In the morning, the fire had burned down to the ground, and it was as deep as a hole. We slept soundly after our hard day's journey, but we were all still stiff from the morning, from the cold, which during the night had been excessive. We prepared breakfast, consisted of little Indian corn and beans boiled in water. On the 25th, after breakfast, we proceeded on our journey. The snow was no deeper, and before noon, we had reached the stream of the branch, which we had left yesterday. The stream where we are now on, the Indians call the Adachi, the lost or the bewildered, which in fact deserves such a name. We proceeded along the stream between 2 terrible mountains. The valley was, however, now about half a mile in width, and the stream flowed now against this, and then against the other mountain among the rocks. Here we held a long council as the best mode of procedure, whether to remain in the valley, consequently to be obliged to cross the stream repeatedly, or endeavor to proceed along the sides of the mountain as we had done yesterday. As it was very cold to wade the creek often, we determined to try the mountainside. As we were climbing along the mountains before we had proceeded a quarter of a mile, Shikalama had unluckily fell, which nearly cost him his life. He had caught hold of a flat stone sticking in the root of a fallen tree, which had come loose when his feet slipped from underneath him. This place was steeper than the roof of a house. He could not catch anything, but it continued falling on the snow and ice for 3 rods when his pack, which he had carried in the Indian fashion, was strapped around the breast, pressed on the side of the sapling, and he had on the other, sapling he on the other, so that he remained hanging by the strap until he could so we could get him some assistance. Oof. That was a mouthful. If he had slipped a half a rod further, he would have fallen over a precipice of over 100 feet upon the craggy rocks. I was 2 steps behind him when he fell. We were all of us in terror. We were obliged to proceed until we reached a place where we could descend to the valley and not taken place for a quarter of an hour. We had reached the valley. Shikalamo looked around at the height of the precipice on which he had fallen. We looked at him, and he stood still in astonishment and said, "I thank the great Lord and Creator of the world. He had mercy on me and wished me to continue to live longer." That's not Gunhake. I'm still alive, I said. We soon came to before the mentioned water, which had a strong current. We therefore cut a pole 12 or 15 feet long, which we took hold and weighted together in case any of us should lose his footing. We could hold the pole. So that's pretty interesting too, thinking about how they would cross in the water like that. We hoped to suffer from excessive cold because the hard frozen snow was still 18 inches deep in the valley and prevented us from walking rapidly. Neither could we warm ourselves by walking because we had to cross the stream 6 or 7 times. The wood was so thick that for a mile at a time we could not find a place of the size of a hand where the sunshine could penetrate even the clearest day. Even on the clearest day. This night we prepared a place to sleep in the same manner as last night. During the night it had begun to storm and the wind blew terribly, which seemed to me strange. The Indians say that this whole valley, which is 60 miles long and storms in this manner or snows every night, is such a desolate region that I often thought I must perish in this frightful wilderness. On the 26th, we passed the whole day in traveling along the stream. The mountains continue high, and we were obliged to wade over the creek many times, but it began to diminish in size, and we could cross several times on fallen timber. Today, Teragat, which was one of the warriors' names, fell in such a violence from a log on another that he fainted and lay in the state for a considerable time. We became very much fatigued today from so often wading the creek in such a cold weather. We often became very hungry. The provision was poor and a little of that. This night we built a hut of branches because it again became cloudy. It stormed again terribly and snowed at times that wished to bury us. But it lasted long. It never lasted long, and in the morning there was little snow on the ground. The Indians believe that in Otko, that's what it says right in the passage, Otko, an evil spirit. And that's funny because that's the words that we can recognize, right? That's what we call like what's going to innate, like that's bad or something like that. But it's funny that it's mentioned right in here too. They have that an evil spirit has power in this valley that some of them could call him by name and brought him sacrifices by which he could be appeased. I asked if any of our party could do this or know his name. They answered no, but few could do this as they were magicians. That's kind of interesting too to look into and think about. The 27th, we followed up on a valley and creek, and the hills became lower as we continued to ascend. Because we had been following up on this water from the time we left Madame on tours, at noon we reached the summit of the mountain. Before we had quite reached the summit, we saw two skulls fixed on a pole, the heads of men who had been killed there a long time before by their prisoners, who had been taken by the South Carolina. The prisoners, who were two resolute men, had found themselves at night untied, which without doubt had been done by the Otko, and having killed their captors, taken possession of their arms, and had returned home. One of the wonders of nature is to be seen here. The creek already mentioned is flowing as if on a summit or height of land, runs with a rapid current towards or against a linden tree, where it divides into two streams. The one stream becomes the water up which have been traveling for 3 days and flowing to the south, empties not too far from the Indian village of Onondago. The other stream flows to the north and empties into the Susquehanna River, 200 miles north of the Shamokin. Both streams finally again unite their waters in the Shamokin, where I can't pronounce that one, but it's a Ongahome word, river empties into the Susquehanna River. The stream flowing to the north is called the Manta, or the fretful or tedious. So I don't know if that's Mohawk or what. It must be Mohawk because that's what he knew. We traveled down the stream towards the evening, reached a place where the snow had entirely disappeared in the grove of white oak trees. The south wind blew very warm and the weather very pleasant. It seemed as if we had escaped from hell. We lay on dry ground. I cooked for supper for as much as I thought we could give us plenty to eat, as we had hoped soon to reach the Susquehanna River, where our Onondaga had persuaded us that we would find provisions in plenty. On the 28th, we ate our last meal for breakfast. We believed that by evening further, we could reach the river and start it immediately after. The warm south wind was still blowing and the sun shining. We left the Manta to the right hand and about 10 o'clock reached the water called Osku, the Fierce. In this rapid, impetuous stream, because it was flowing among the mountains and became the wind, has melted the snow in the highest forest. We first cut down long pine trees, but it did not reach the other shore, and we carried away by the current. The Indians advised that we should wade through the water. We should wade through holding a long pole, but I would not agree to that because the water was too deep. We knew not what we could do. While we were cutting down the tree, the water had risen a foot. As we could not agree upon which would be done, and were irritable, from hunger, and the Indians began to abuse Stolfo, that's the white companion, who they said was to blame, and that I had not followed their advice. When I took his part, they treated me the same way, called me a coward who loved his life but must die of hunger on the spot. I said this is true that we Europeans love our lives, but we also those of our fellow creatures. The Indians, on the contrary, loved their lives also, but often murdered one another, which the Europeans did not do, which is not true. Love to do. Right, where did I lose that? Do. And therefore the Indians were cruel creatures. Those advice could not be followed in the circumstances like the present. That they wished to make a raft and cross the other shore, which was impossible to do at this place as the account of the rapidity of the current and the rocks in the bed of the stream. I said to them that I had so far followed their advice, but now I required them to follow mine and follow the stream downwards until we reached the quiet place. Even if we could go to the Susquehanna River because of the level of the land, the water was not rapid, so among the hills and mountains. Chikalamo answered that I did not know how far it was to the Susquehanna River. They knew it better than I did, and it was an impossibility. And he said to frighten me, but I knew I did. frightened me, but I knew it could not be done more than a short day's journey to the following course we were traveling, because I examined the compass several times every day. I could also tell by the mountains on the right hand of the stream as we descended, which appeared to become which would become lost. Whereas upon the stream, they appeared much higher, which around judgment would infer that a man could not go as far as to find a current lessen or crease. Shikalama restored that was the guide, as being the person who had traveled the route often. While I had never done so, he would cross there if I refused, so I must bear the blame if I lost my life by hunger or any other accidents. He would also complain to the governor, Thomas Penn, and James Logan of my folly and excuse himself. So they don't want to get blamed for this white guy making his decisions and losing his life. Because this would be another diplomatic issue as well, too, if this guy ended up dying out there. James Logan of my folly excusable himself. The others spoke to much of the same purpose, particularly Turagant, who was returning from the wars, who said openly that he was too proud to obey a European. I answered them all, in particular Shikalama, is it true that he was appointed by the governor to be my guide, but not my commander? And since he would not guide me on my path, I wished to go, namely down the creek, and wished to be my master. I set him free from his duty. He might go where he pleased. I intended to go on my own guide and positively take up my own course with my own fellow traveler Stuffle. But I would still advise him to obey me at this time, which I did. Friendly request and parting, I then took my pack and moved off. The Onondaga followed me immediately. Shikalama did not hesitate long after he saw that I was in earnest and soon followed. Taragat remained behind because, as he said, he was too proud and obstinate to follow me. We had gone more than a mile downstream, and I observed the nature that had provided everything that requisite for safe crossing. The current had ceased entirely, and there was much dry pine timber, which is the lightest wood that can be found in this purposes. Here I threw down my pack and ordered my companion to do the same. On their inquiring the reason, I said we could cross here. When Shikalama observed the opportunity, he was glad, fired off his gun and shouted to make our companion, who remained behind, here. We went to work, and in about an hour we had a raft. We had a raft of dry pine timber, mentioned already, and passed over safely. Stuffle and the Onondaga crossed again to fetch the 2 hatchets that we had forgotten. And all was done without any danger. We turned up again to the stream and we struck our path. My Indian companions thanked me for my good counsel and resting with the wishes so boldly. We traveled rapidly on for this purpose of reaching the Susquehanna River. This evening, where some Indians had resided, when we had come to the site, we sat down and where the Indians resided, and we came to a site where we sat down to the rest. Yet we were in trouble for our abstinent Taraganit, or I can't even make that one out, who had remained behind after he had been sitting there for about an hour and a half. On his questioning as how he had crossed, the Onondaga related that the mode of which he was surprised and stated that he had tried several pieces of wood together and pushed off into the water, but was so hurried away by the current, in spite of his efforts with a pole, that he reached a small island which he was just above the place we crossed at, where the raft separated. He was obliged to wade through the remaining distance of the water up to his armpits. I reproved him for his pride and obstinacy. He acknowledged that he had acted foolishly and that he had heard of our firing but already engaged in making his raft. We proceeded on our journey, well pleased that we had all together again, and the same evening reached some Indians living in the Susquehanna River, where we, however, found nothing but hungry people, who sustained life with juices of sugar trees. We, however, procured a little weak soup made of cornmeal. I had a quantity of Indian trinkets with me, but we could procure no meal. My only comfort this evening was whoever labors or is tired will find sleep sweet. On the 20th, we proceeded on our journey at an early hour, but without breakfast. Reached a dangerous place where the path had bottom land, was overflowed by river, and was very high. We had to cross a very high mountain, which was not much better than the one where Shikalama had almost met his fate. We passed safely toward the evening. We were almost safely ferried away into a canoe. It was a great branch of the Susquehanna River. All the streams are very high, for the streams had been uncommonly deep this winter. This water is called the Onondago and comes from the region of the, I can't even make that one out, Senecas and Cayugas. There are many Indians living here, partly Cayugas, partly Mohawks. The Mohicans said for themselves, we went into several huts to get meat, but they had nothing, as they said for themselves, or they said for themselves. The men were mostly absent hunting. Some of the old mothers asked us for bread. We returned to our quarters with a Mohikander who directed his old gray-headed mother to cook soup for us of Indian corn. She hung up a large kettle over a fire, also a smaller one with potash, and made them boil briskly. While she was to do this, the potash was a mystery to me, for I soon saw that it was not for a purpose of washing, as some of the Indians are in this practice of doing, by making a lye and washing their full and dirty clothes. For the skin of her body was not unlike the bark of a tree, from the dirt which had not been washed off for a long time, and it was quite dried and cracked on her fingers and nails, like an eagle's claws. She finally took the ash kettle off the fire and put it aside until it had settled, and later a clear liquor on top, which she carefully poured into the kettle of corn. I inquired of my companions why this was done, and she told me it was the practice of these and the Senecas, or the Shawnee, when they had neither meat nor grease, to mix their food with lye prepared in this manner, which made it slippery and pleasant to eat. When the soup was thus prepared, the larger portion was given to us out of hunger. I had quietly eaten a portion of it, which was not of bad taste. The dirty cook and the unclean vessel was more repulsive. After I had eaten a little and quieted the worst cravings of hunger, I took some of my goods and quietly left the hut without being noticed by my companions, and went into another hut, and gave the old gray-headed mother 24 needles and 6 shoestrings, and begged her to give me some more bread and made of Indian corn. So cornbread. You talk about making corn soup and cornbread. If it were only as much as I could eat at one meal, she immediately gave me 5 small loaves of a pound weight, which I and Stuffle ate 2 the same evening. The Indians ate so much of the soup, they became sick. We had intended to have had a day of rest here, if we could just procure meat, but had to be content to proceed on our journey. The 30th, we proceeded on our journey without having anything to eat except the remaining loaves, which were divided among us 5. We passed a dangerous creek by wading through the shallow water and passing the stream on a half-fallen tree, which hung across the water. The current was frightful. An Indian from the last village who was to help us over the water and show us the path fell into the water, so that we saw neither hide or hair, but soon rose and saved himself by swimming to the opposite shore, to the one where we were trying to reach. Towards the evening, we arrived at the branch of the Oswego. The Indian village was on the other side of the river, about a mile off. All the bottom land between us and the village was underwater, and the current was rapid. We fired our guns 3 times, but no one would hear or show themselves. If we had not seen the smoke of the huts, we would have thought the village was deserted. We began to prepare a fire and wood for a camp, and having made a long day's journey with hungry stomachs, were about to retire to sleep in the condition, and had already laid down when a great storm had came up from the west, with the thunder and lightning and such a great violent rain that it was almost incredible. We could not find a place to lie down, but stood the whole night around the fire. Towards morning, it became very cold, and the ice formed in every direction. The day before having been very warm and succeeded by the thunderstorm, of which it was the cause. At dawn, we again commenced firing our pieces, on which a canoe with some women at last came from the village to take us across the river, as we supposed, but they only came over the bottom land to the edge of the river, where they called to us. There was no men in the village. The women could not venture to cross the raging flood, which was the unusual height. That bottom land was flooded, which had not been the case for many years, and in particular as their canoe was small. So the warrior Taragat, whose home was there, called them to venture. When they heard that it was Tawagaret, sorry, that's his name, Taragaret, they came across safely. They came across safely, and I stepped in ashore. One of them spoke not a word, but wrapped her face in a blanket. The others gave the canoe to the Indians to ferry us across. Afterwards, to bring the women. all which was done in 3 times crossing backwards and forwards, but not without great and immediate danger. Our party was landed here and the others there in a dry place, but still had to pass sundry hollows and ditches and waters up to the breasts. The land is very uneven. I first went in the canoe, 4 of us, of whom 2 Indians went back in the canoe. I had new reasons to praise the protection of God, who had rescued us from such immediate peril. The water flew between the trees and like arrows flown from a bow, which we had now struck, and one of the which were so many we must have perished. The Indians gladly received us into their huts and showed us their compassion. Some of them were old acquaintances of mine from Skalhari. They gave us food repeatedly, but each time only a little, so not to injure our health. They were Kugas. All the men were absent hunting, except for a couple old grey-headed men, who all had lodged at my house in Skalhari, some 15 or 16 years ago. All had shown me many favors according to their hospitality or their ability. Tavagara remained here and lodged in the hut for his mother-in-law. The woman had hidden her face was his wife, and did so for modesty. Such is the custom among the virtuous women in the Indian tribes. We remained here today to recruit ourselves a little and to procure provisions for the further progresses of our journey. On April 1st, we still remained here. By reckoning, we are now 280 miles from home. On April 2nd, we started from about noon on our journey and reached the waters called Onondago, and were immediately taken across in a canoe. Several families of the Onondagas live here, with whom which of them is an old acquaintance. We took up our lodgings and were well treated. On the 3rd, we reached the village of Ostaninki, inhabited by Onondagas and Chani. I was here at this place in the year 1726, but find my old acquaintances of the period partly absent or partly dead. We had still 5 days' journey according to the report of those Indians from here to Onondaga. The object of our tiresome journey, as we could not take the nearest route by reason of numerous creeks and must be kept upon the hills. The family with whom we had lodged had not a mouthful to eat. The larger part of this village had been living far more than a month on juice of the sugar trees, which was as common here as hickory in Pennsylvania. We shared our small stock of provisions and sundry sick and provisions with the sundry sick and children, whom stood before us in tears while we were eating. From the time as we left Madame Latour's, I generally gave to each one of us his daily portion. I gave my own portion to some of the poor creatures I met, not to sour our looks, but if I took from the capital stock to give to them, my companions showed great dissatisfaction. But this did not hinder a thief from stealing while we were asleep. The remainder of our stock of bread was but small. This was the first misfortune that had happened to us. The second was that we had heard the snow was still knee-deep in the direction that we were planning to travel, and it was still impossible to proceed. The third was that the rainy weather in which we had arrived in was turned to snow, on which 18 inches fell into one night. The worst was that we had nothing to eat, and our bodily strength began to fail. From many trials, both hunger and cold, here we were obliged to remain and to pass the time in distress. I could not be sure to purchase with needles and Indian shoestrings sugar and made from the juices of the tree, already mentioned, on which we sustained life. But it did not agree with us. We became quite ill, and much drinking to quench our thirst, caused by the sweetness of the sugar. My companion Stuffle became impatient out of the spirits and wished himself dead. He desired me to procure a canoe in which to float down the streams until we reached Pennsylvania, which might have been done in 6 to 8 days, but not without provisions, not without considerable danger, as the Susquehanna was very high and rapid, and we did not know the channel in such a swollen state of the water. But I now determined that on no account to return home without accomplishing the objective of my mission, and particularly I knew the danger of the river. 2 weeks before I could gladly have turned back, as I foresaw all the difficulties we must undergo and conquer. But no one would return back, or see difficulties I feared. Stuffle wished to have followed my advice at the time. I was now, however, so resigned to misery that I could not have submitted to the greatest bodily hardships without resistance, since I had not been relieved from the tortures of my mind from the wonderful hand of God. I had at a previous period in my life wished that I had never heard of God, either from my parents or other people, from the idea that I had of him, from any of him. I thought the atheists were more happy than those who had cared much more about God. Oh, how far man has removed from God, yes, and inexplicably far, although God is near and cannot impart the last thing to corrupt man until he has given himself up without condition. So it's a little bit more, it gets into like a little philosophy there. We'll just kind of jump ahead there. But to return to our affairs, I called the Indians together, represented to them the importance of my errand, and say that I wish to command it to be, that I was commanded to both by the government of Virginia and Pennsylvania, and required to them, the faithful allies of the English and particular friends of the government of Pennsylvania, to furnish with me provisions to my party so that I could reach Onondaga at the end of my journey. Because the business related especially to the allied Six Nations, for those to sake that their brother Thomas Penn had taken such an interest in their affair and had sent me on a journey to the inclement time of the year for the purpose of preventing further bloodshed unnecessarily and out of mere revenge, that they might possess their lands and raise their provisions in peace. In the next place I required them to send out 2 messengers on snowshoes as soon as possible, in the advance of who should make known of my approach, so the councilmen of the Six Nations could be called together, with which required 3 weeks. Which is, again, is a little interesting tidbit right there too, is that, to have council together during this time, it would take about 3 weeks. There was an old war chief from Onondaga present, by which interference both points were agreed to only no one knew where to procure provisions for us, or the 2 Indian messengers. By general consent, a hut was broken into whose occupants were far absent on the hunt, and so much corn was taken as the judged sufficient to be able to reach Onondaga. The 2 runners received a share, and the balance, about 1/3 of a bushel, was given to us, which was thankfully received. I had pounded it at the house we had occupied, and not done so without loss. Hunger is a great tyrant. He does not spare the best friends, much less strangers. A Frenchman who had been taken captive when a boy, but now an Indian, in appearance, if not worse, together with another young Indian, were sent off to notify my arrival at the council at Onondaga. The last fall of snow was rapidly disappearing, and the weather had become warm. On the 6th of April, the runners started. In the meanwhile, an Indian had the kindness to invite me privately to a supper. I took Stuffle with me. He gave us to eat by night on 2 occasions. A third time, another old acquaintance presented me with a small loaves one evening, which I immediately divided amongst my companions and the surrounding hungry children. These Indians often came to my lodgings or invited me to their huts. For the purpose of talking, they are very inquisitive. And thus we passed the hungry hours away in relating old or new events or traditions and smoking tobacco. Could you imagine being a fly on the wall in the hat just to hear what the people had to say back then? When they had plenty. Among other things, I asked them, how did it happen that they were so short of provisions now? While 12 years ago they had a greater supply than all other Indians, and now their children look like dead persons and suffered much from hunger. They answered now that game was scarce, and that hunting had strangely failed since last winter. Some of them have procured nothing at all, that the Lord and Creator of the world has resolved to destroy the Indians. One of their seers, so it's really interesting that you see seer mentioned here, but they had their seers trying to figure this out. One of their seers said whom they named had seen a vision of God, who had said to them the following words: "You inquire after the cause of why game has been scarce," and this is all in bold in his journal. "Scarce, I will tell you. You kill it for the sake of the skins, which you give for strong liquor and drown yourselves, and kill one another, and carry on dreadful debauchery. Therefore, I deprive the wild animals of this country, for they are mine. If you will do good and cease from your sins, I will bring them back. If not, I will destroy you from the earth." And again, that kind of falls within lines with the indigenous way of thinking as well, too. Like, we're over hunting, we're not treating it right? We're not within our customs that, it's for our survival. Like they say that in the Onondaga, you drop it for their bodies to nourish our lives, and you can see why they're suffering. It kind of ties to each other, right? Like, you could see they're being punished that way. I inquired if they believed that the seer had been seen and heard. The answer was yes, and some believed it would happen so. Others also believed it, but gave themselves no concern about it. Time will show, said they, what is to happen to us. Rum will kill us and leave us the land clear for the Europeans without strife or purchase. The Indians living here are on the arm of the Susquehanna, which comes from the high mountains, so you can kind of get an idea where they're living at the time. On a rapid stream, I saw the children here walking up and down the banks of the stream along the lowland, where the high water washed and the wild potatoes on the ground, acorns under the ground. Wild potatoes, that's a little hint towards that clan as well too, the wild potato clan. Maybe you've heard of that before. All right. Wild potatoes, ground acorns on the ground. These grow here all along the stream, or along a stem or root, about the size of a thick straw. There are frequently from 5 to 10 hanging to such a root, which is often more than 6 feet long. The richer the soil, the longer they grow, the greater quantity on the ground. The largest of one of the sides of the pigeon's egg on a larger, and look much in the size and shape of black acorns. I thought of the words of Job, so I guess it's a Christian reference. While these barbarians are satisfying their hunger with these roots and rejoicing greatly, they found them in large numbers and dug them up. A little bit of, yeah. On the 7th, we agreed to leave this place at once and again to pass through a great wilderness to reach the end of our journey. We started at 8 o'clock in the morning from this miserable place where much murders occur in any other nation. It is called by the Indians, particularly a den of murderers, where every year so many are swallowed up. About noon, we met our messengers returning, who said that it was impossible to proceed on account of the deep snow in the mountains, which was more than knee-deep. We debated long, and we decided by a majority of voices to postpone our journey until better weather and roads. The before-mentioned old war chief had accompanied us because he was a leading man in the war council at Onondaga and wished to accompany us for a purpose of advancing my business, and wished to accompany me for the purpose of advancing my business to a favorable termination. He was a gray-headed man of 70 years, and he showed by circumstantial proofs. He advised me confidently to proceed on the journey and promised to guide us by such a route that if we used our best efforts, we would be there by tomorrow evening, reach a country where the snow had disappeared by reason of open forests. After 2 days of fatigue and trouble, said he, you will be better off than by turning back with your business undone after having already undergone so many hardships from cold, snow, and high water and hunger. I was pleased with his well-meant advice, for he often called me his son and child, and bade him lead on. Made him lead on. For he was such interested in the object of my mission, we proceeded on our journey. Rainy weather set in, and before night we were in snow up to our knees. We made a hut evening of bark and linden with trees peeled off. It rained the whole night with a warm south wind, which converted the snow into slush. On the 8th, we traveled from the early in the morning until evening with a great rapidity. In constant rain through the dreadful thick wilderness such as I had never seen before. We frequently fell into holes and ditches where we required the assistance of others to extract ourselves. We all lost courage. This was the hardest and most fatiguing day's journey I had ever made. My bodily strength was so exhausted that I trembled and shook so much all over that I thought I must fall from the weariness and perish. I stepped aside and sat down under a tree to die, which I hoped would be hastened by a cold approaching night. When my companions remarked at my absence, they waited for me some time and returned to seek me, and found me sitting under a tree, but I would not be persuaded to proceed, for I thought beyond my power. The entreaties of the old chief and the sensible reasoning of Shikalamo, who said that the evil days were better for us than good, for the first often warned us against sins and washed them out, while the latter often enticed us to sin, caused me to alter my resolution, and I rose. But I would not keep up with the old man, who was the leader and a good walker. He often waited for the whole party. We slept on the snow again that night. It rained the whole night, but not violently. On the 9th, we prepared breakfast before day and settled early in cloudy weather. Before noon, we got to the thick forests that scattered the grooves, and the snow had disappeared, and the old man had assured us. We seemed to have escaped all of our troubles in this dreadful region, especially as the sun broke through the clouds and cheered us with his warm rays. If the snow in the forest had remained the same as yesterday, we must have all perished before reaching Onondaga. But hunger was still pinching us. To eat a little cornmeal was of no benefit, for it was only a meal and water. The wheat bread and good meal had not only left our stomachs, but our whole limbs as well. We were now on high mountains, and today we had passed the first waters flowing into the Great Lake Ontario, or the St. Lawrence, out of which the famous river, the St. Lawrence, flows, which passes through New France or Canada. From all appearances, this is the most elevated region of North America. We passed several small runs on the left hand, which joined the lake just as mentioned. To the right were others who had joined the Susquehanna, a day's journey from here, and where waters were emptying into the Hudson, and to the east and to the west, and the distant waters were joining to the Mississippi. We reached several small lakes and ponds, at one in which the Indians said an evil spirit in the shape of a great snake resided, who frequently was visible. Interesting. Kind of need to look into that a little bit more, because I know we have stories about those giant serpents as well too, so it's kind of interesting when you get these little details in here, right? Evil spirit shape of a snake that resided in the mountain, resided who had frequently visible. The Indians refused to drink here. On the 10th, we left our camp quite early, as we hoped to reach the end of the journey this day. About noon, we passed a hill which, by an Indian tradition, corn, pumpkins, and tobacco first grew, and were discovered through an extraordinary vision. So that's a little interesting little tidbit there too. What does that mean? All right, so as we felt sure of reaching Onondaga, we cooked the balance of our meal in a great hurry and hastened onward. It began to rain hard. Today we made 40 miles, and timber was principally sugar trees. That evening we reached the first villages of Onondaga to our great delight. Not a soul remained in the houses. All came running out to see us. They had been made acquainted with our coming by the old chief a quarter of an hour previously, who had preceded us for that purpose. They came in crowds to the houses we occupied. I found here several acquaintances, but they were surprised at my miserable aspect. One said, "Is it he?" Another said, "No, it is another person altogether." It is not the custom among these people for a stranger who has come from a distance to speak until he is questioned, which is never done until he has had food set before him, and his clothes dried, and which things they did not allow us to want. So again, you see like that little bit of a custom there, like where you may hear of like the edge of the woods they talk about during the Great Law time, where you have these people who are traveling, who are going through these, horrific adventures just to get to one place to deliver a message. And you can see all that stuff, and that's why they would have to sit them down, and that's why they would take the thorns out. That's why you see like that edge of the woods, like they do all that custom for that. Like that's why, because you're suffering just to get there, and like by the time you get there, you're barely alive. All right. Honor and praises, glory and power be given to Almighty God, who reached us from so many various evils and dangers and saved us from death and destruction, from doubt and despair and other hazards. When on inquiry by assembled males, I answered that I was sent to them by the brethren Onus. So that's Thomas Penn. That was the name given to William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, and that was the traditional name that they gave him in council as well. It means the pen, or the feather, or the quill, or something like that. James Logan, with an extraordinary commission, a messenger was immediately sent to the chief village about 4 miles off to make known my approach and ascertain the wishes of council, whether I should remain here or was to go forward. At midnight, the messenger returned with advice that a house was prepared for me in the main village, where my arrival was anxiously awaited. On the 11th of April, we accompanied an early hour to the village, and the house of which I was prepared for us. It was that named of a man named, I can't even make out the text of it, but it has his name in there, and that's important as well too. A relative of one of the chiefs who received us kindly. After we had been left to ourselves and had eaten something, the head man of the chief came in and gave me a string of wampum according to the law and custom of their country, so that I was very welcome on account of the message I was commissioned by brethren Onus and James Logan to deliver to their council, that I would deliver it as soon as I wished. I thanked them for their goodwill and delivered a string of wampum in token of greeting from their brethren Onus and James Logan, with a request that the whole council of the Six Nations might be called together as soon as possible for the objects of embassy. I was sent on related to the whole of them, and were of great importance. They answered that each nation there were some chiefs present, except for the Cayugas, which would need no obstacle. Those present were fully empowered to transact the affairs of importance. The following day was therefore appointed to give me an audience. On the 12th of April, they assembled at my lodgings to a number of about 40 men, who all entered with great gravity and pride. When they were all collected to hear me, the president said to me, they were ready to hear me, and I rose and delivered my message in the Mohawk language, which I spoke with the most facility and which they all understood. After each principal subject, after which there were two, I delivered to them a bolt of wampum and a string of eight after, I can't even make out what that says. So 8 long in the name of Governor of Virginia and Thomas Penn, Proprietor of Pennsylvania. They resolved to give me an answer in 2 days to part relating to the truce and the Congress at Williamsburg. After all was over, the feast was prepared, the food was brought in by other chiefs and set down in the middle of the house in a variety of vessels. Each one brought his own dish and spoon and helped himself to the meal as he chose. After the feast was over, the discourse turned on to events of our journey. As a signal from the speaker, they all went away to allow us to retire to rest. I received that evening already an invitation to answer. It was full satisfactory. And Chikalama was very sick and also Stoffel, which was probably caused by the imprudence in eating, so they overate. But in 2 days, they were again well. So on the 14th, the council again assembled together with all the males who were at home, and the whole of my messages were repeated by the speaker, and I was asked to correctly state it in response. On my answering yes, the speaker proceeded in their answer and was given at large, with the remark that I should be comprehended and fully. So as to be able to report correctly to the Governor of Virginia and Onus, they agreed to the truce and decided against the Williamsburg and chose Albany as the meeting place. So that's the end I got for the story. But as you can see, like, it does tell you so much about like our culture that's kind of embedded within the story. Like you wouldn't really notice it until it just mentions something like, oh, we did here, but we talked to these people and you added this information there. And that's what like it totally blows me away. Is like you get those little customs that you see there. You get the names of these people, you get the names of our chiefs, and it's something that you can compare with like our hereditary chief title list, right? Like those are all the type of stuff that you can do with it. It kind of reminds me of that one Leonardo DiCaprio movie, if you haven't seen that one, where he has to, cut up that horse and he has to sleep in that horse because it's such a wilderness. Or he has to just suffer. Like, is this like him suffering? He won the Oscar for it. They made him suffer for that Oscar, but he got it. But yeah, that's that story there. There's just so many little instances there, and it's like, why are they hungry like that? And then why is there so many cultural references in this historical narrative? There's so many little things that you pick up. The other thing that's really neat with him is that when he was a young man, when he was a little boy, there was a Mohawk village where he lived, and his dad sent him to go live with him. And so that's where he ended up picking the Mohawk language up, because he lived with them for so much time. They gave him a name and stuff like that. So yeah, that's like Six Nations in Pennsylvania. And so at that time, like our history is all combined up until the American Revolution. That's where we end up splitting up, and that's where we're over in Canada. But at this time and place, we're all connected in here, this area here. And if you ever look at the Treaty of Lancaster, 1744, they explain why Six Nations has such a huge influence all the way down to Virginia and going all the way down to the south. Is what I call it, Golden Age or something like that. But yeah, Six Nations had a lot of influence all the way down south, almost towards Florida. And then it expanded westward as well too, because that's where you had the Osage, or the Wasase, we call them Wasase Hono, and then we get that dance from them. Anyways, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of little things like that all throughout our history and these historical narratives. Like, keep in mind, this is only one account. There's 4 other accounts that he talks about little cultural tidbits in there, names of people, creeks, place names, little things like that. So as a researcher, these are the things that you take out and you're like, oh, we need to start compiling this information together and seeing, like, is there more accounts like this, and can you compile all that information together and kind of share it with everybody? So those like the little interesting things that you can find in there. And of course, if you can find the original account or the original version, it may have other things that are different in there. It may even have pictures or descriptions in there that you can't get when you're just typing everything out. So sometimes you miss those kind of things if you don't look at the original source. But again, those are the good clues, is just going through like what's published. Like, they have the colonial records all published now, you can access them. But they have the original sources all within the state archives, you can access them. Like Pennsylvania has a state archives, Virginia has a state archives, Maryland has a state archives, and that's where all the colonial records are housed. So you can still access the originals. Very hard to read if you can read that handwriting, but it's worth it. Because you may find like descriptions of waffle belts, you may find sketches of waffle belts, or you may find like a bunch of little cultural stuff like that in the story here. And so that's why you can see like our people really did care about food. That's why like you see it, like it really ties into like our Gunahanyot, all that stuff, why we give thanks to all this stuff, because it could be gone. And like, how many historical accounts have you seen mention seers? So he got it right. Like, he was right in there. Like, he got that. Like, he was there talking to people. Because how else would he have to know to ask that kind of question or know that that's the term that you would use for that? Blows my mind anyway, and I see that kind of stuff. Because you don't expect to see that. Like, why did that pop up there? And it's like, well, you can see, like, we were doing the same thing that we do this time. If something big happened and nobody knew what to do about it, I'm sure they would contact their seers. So I know, like, in our personal lives, when we don't know something's going on, that's where you go see is the seer. Like, we'll figure that out. They're facing the same thing again, and they were doing the same thing. They're consulting seers. Like, it's just the same thing that we see here. That's why I like those historical accounts, because yes, he does have a little bit of racism, but it's, it's a product of his time. And he wasn't even considered as a super racist at the time. Like, he was very progressive. He lived with Native people. He spoke the language and everything like that. But yeah, he has like all these little other stories too that are really interesting. Anyways, so I don't know. I don't know how much time we have. I don't know if that's our time. Oh shit.
Are there any questions? What's your name?
Taylor Gibson. I teach history here. Oh yeah, I better get rolling by the way too. By the way, I'll leave this here for you too as well. So you can add that. You can add that to the thing.
I don't know if he was in the story, but what was his message that he was teaching?
Oh, the message.
Another whole story.
Yeah, that's the other part of it, because I knew we were going to run low on time. But his part of it was to deliver peace between. He was the broker peace between the Catawbas and the Cherokees and the Six Nations, because that's who we're always fighting. And then, because another event that will take place in a couple of years later is this storyline called The Late and Unhappy Skirmers in Virginia. And it's about people who are traveling down to fight the Cherokees and Catawbas still. Actually, I think I may have the link on that too. Yeah, it should be up there. The Skirmers in Virginia, 1742. So that's something that happens later on. So you can click on that too, and it'll take you straight to the link. That's all linked out. So they're all hyperlinked. So anyways, that's where you can kind of see that kind of stuff that's in there. But yeah, he doesn't stop it. They just stop for a year, but he doesn't end up stopping the conflict, because they keep going down there, and then they end up getting fight these Virginians there. There's a lot of deep history in there too, because there's this whole thing about the pass system, that is only Six Nations people could pass through Virginia at the time. And they had like these things. So again, like, it's very interesting. And then there's just too much history to dig in for the time that we have. Yeah, so anyways, that's why he was to broker peace. And they agreed to it at the time, but then it doesn't hold out until further down the line. But they do actually have treaties with the Catawbas, the Cherokees, that are all documented. All very public as well.